September 7, 1940. London had just endured the opening salvo of the Luftwaffe's Blitz, and the city was still shaking from the thunder of bombs dropped hours earlier. Smoke curled from shattered neighborhoods, fire engines screamed through narrow streets, and the exhausted but unbroken citizens tried to resume their routines. Above them, the night sky seemed alive with danger. Every flash of tracer fire, every streak of light from searchlights, was a signal that the city was under constant surveillance from the air. But London and the rest of southern England had a weapon that many Luftwaffe pilots feared almost as much as the Hurricanes and Spitfires, the Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft gun, later augmented by the revolutionary QF 3.7-inch gun, which had been adapted to fire at astonishing speeds. By 1940, British engineers and ordnance officers had refined a system capable of firing 2,400 rounds per minute, a rate of fire that was nearly incomprehensible for the era. It wasn't just the volume of shells that made the weapon deadly, it was the precision, the coordination, and the psychological effect on enemy crews. The development of this high-speed anti-aircraft system had begun years before the war, spurred by the recognition that traditional artillery could not reliably bring down fast-moving aircraft. In the mid-1930s, German and Italian air forces were modernizing rapidly. High-altitude bombers could fly past existing coastal guns with relative impunity. The British War Office, in collaboration with the Royal Artillery and private ordnance firms, began experimenting with automatic loading, rapid-fire mechanisms that could track and engage aircraft moving at hundreds of miles per hour. By 1938, prototypes were being tested on coastal ranges and airfields. Engineers had to solve two fundamental problems: recoil management and ammunition feed. At rates approaching 2,400 rounds per minute, conventional breech-loading designs were destroyed by the forces involved. The solution came in part from an unlikely source: naval gunnery. Designers adapted mechanisms used on destroyers and cruisers, where rapid firing and high accuracy were already critical, scaling them down for land-based operations. The QF 3.7-inch gun, when paired with advanced predictors, mechanical analog computers that calculated the speed, altitude, and trajectory of incoming aircraft, transformed static artillery into a responsive, almost intelligent weapon system. Operators trained for months to master these predictors, learning to anticipate Luftwaffe flight patterns, adjusting for wind, shell drift, and aircraft maneuvering. Each gun pit became a hive of activity. The operator's rhythm was precise: load, aim, calculate, fire. In well-trained batteries, the rounds formed a near-continuous wall of flak across the sky. By the summer of 1940, anti-aircraft defenses had been deployed around key industrial cities, ports, and the approaches to London. Every RAF airfield and critical installation had its complement of AA guns, supported by a network of searchlights, radar guidance, and observer posts. The combination of technology allowed these weapons to engage the Luftwaffe long before bombers could release their payloads over target. For German pilots, the effect was immediate and terrifying. The first time a bomber formation encountered concentrated British AA fire, they reported the sky turning into a storm of steel. Explosions flashed around them, creating clouds of shrapnel that could tear wings, puncture fuselages, and force crews into evasive maneuvers that increased fuel consumption and reduced bombing accuracy. One veteran Luftwaffe pilot later described approaching London during a night raid. The sky was alive with fire. You could hear the whine of shells as they passed, and you never knew where the next one would strike. It was as though the heavens themselves were shooting at us. The British gunners, meanwhile, were highly aware of the effect their fire had on morale. The presence of rapid-firing AA guns wasn't just defensive, it was psychological warfare. Pilots faced the choice of pressing the attack through a hail of thousands of rounds per minute, or breaking formation and risking the wrath of their own command. In many ways, the AA guns acted as invisible wingmen for the RAF, striking fear, disrupting cohesion and softening targets before British fighters even arrived. Behind this system was an intricate network of observation posts, range-finding equipment, and communication lines. Spotters in elevated positions used optical instruments to track enemy aircraft, feeding data to the predictors at each battery. By the time a formation approached the city, gunners had calculated firing solutions that accounted for speed, altitude, wind, and even predicted evasive maneuvers. Shells flew in carefully timed bursts, creating a lethal curtain that few Luftwaffe crews could penetrate without damage. At night, the system became even more sophisticated. Searchlights painted bombers in bright cones, allowing predictors to lock onto their paths even in darkness. Radar guidance, a relatively new addition, further improved accuracy, giving operators early warning of approaching formations. The combination of radar, searchlights, and rapid-fire guns transformed the London skies into a near-impenetrable defensive zone. The first major engagements demonstrated just how deadly this combination could be. In August 1940, Luftwaffe raids over the Thames estuary and industrial towns were met by concentrated AA fire. Hundreds of shells burst in the air, producing a lethal shower of fragments. Coordination between anti-aircraft batteries and fighter command reached unprecedented levels. Radar stations could track incoming formations long before they reached coastal defenses, sending data directly to both AA command posts and RAF controllers. In practice, this meant that as soon as German bombers crossed the channel, they were tracked simultaneously by radar, spotters, and AA predictors. Squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires were vectored to intercept, often coinciding perfectly with the timing of the AA barrages. From the Luftwaffe perspective, it appeared that British defenses had pre-knowledge of every move, and in a sense, they did. During some of the largest raids, individual AA batteries could fire thousands of rounds in a single hour. The noise was deafening, the ground shook with each detonation, and the sky above seemed to boil with explosive bursts. Reports from the Luftwaffe pilots described aircraft disintegrating mid-flight, engines damaged by shrapnel, and crews forced to bail out over the Channel or the English countryside. Even when pilots survived, their aircraft often returned riddled with holes, forcing emergency landings and reducing operational strength. The British public, witnessing the nightly defense from the ground, interpreted the AA fire as a form of reassurance. Each shell burst was a statement that the city was not helpless, that innovation and training could hold the enemy at bay. Workers in factories, children huddled in shelters, and soldiers preparing to defend urban perimeters all drew confidence from the relentless rhythm of the guns. In many ways, the AA batteries became as symbolic as the RAF itself, a visible, audible commitment that Britain would resist no matter the cost. By November 1940, the Luftwaffe had begun to alter its tactics significantly. High-altitude bombing runs replaced low-level assaults in some areas, and staggered flight paths were attempted to confuse predictors. However, these adaptations had limited effect. British predictors, combined with continuous observation, radar input, and rapid-fire capabilities, mitigated most changes. The guns' high rate of fire allowed them to compensate for uncertainty, creating a lethal cloud of explosive fragments that few bombers could penetrate without sustaining serious damage. The combination of mechanical ingenuity, human training, and technological integration ensured that British anti-aircraft guns were more than defensive tools. They were instruments of strategic deterrence. The Luftwaffe was forced to contend with not just the possibility of interception by fighters, but the certainty of encountering a sky filled with calculated, relentless, and intelligent fire. By combining these elements, Britain effectively turned its cities and critical infrastructure into zones of controlled chaos for enemy pilots. In retrospect, the British anti-aircraft system of 1940 was a masterclass in early integrated air defense. It combined technology, human skill, and foresight in a manner that had never before been attempted. Rapid-fire guns, advanced predictors, radar guidance, searchlights, and observation posts all worked in concert to create a network that was both resilient and adaptive. Each component amplified the others, creating a force multiplier that allowed Britain to withstand the Blitz despite being outnumbered in the air. The Luftwaffe's experience against these defenses would become a textbook example of how speed, precision, and coordination could outweigh raw numbers. Pilots who survived raids over heavily defended cities returned with harrowing tales of skybound maelstroms, aircraft shredded by shrapnel, and formations broken before bombs could be released. For them, the British anti-aircraft gun was no longer just a weapon, it was a symbol of an enemy who had combined human ingenuity, mechanical brilliance, and technological innovation into a machine that could anticipate, adapt, and dominate the skies. By December 1940, the effectiveness of Britain's high-speed anti-aircraft guns had begun to influence not just the Luftwaffe's tactics, but the very strategy of the German air campaign. Intelligence reports from returning pilots indicated growing frustration. The familiar patterns of flight that had once allowed them to reach London or industrial targets unscathed were now riddled with risk. Each mission carried the probability of encountering a storm of shells capable of tearing apart aircraft in seconds. German planners noted that pilots were increasingly requesting changes in formation altitude, spacing, and approach paths to minimize exposure. But the AA defenses adapted with equal speed. Operators on the ground had grown more experienced, their calculations almost instinctive after months of continuous engagement. The predictor operators, once considered specialists requiring months of training, now coordinated seamlessly with gunners and spotters. Data from radar and visual observation allowed operators to anticipate bomber maneuvers before they were executed. A formation banking too sharply or climbing too fast would immediately alter firing solutions across the battery. Each gun fired in coordinated sequences, creating overlapping bursts of flak that left little room for error. It was not uncommon for one battery, with careful timing, to saturate a volume of airspace with hundreds of shells in under 30 seconds, forcing the Luftwaffe pilots to scatter or risk catastrophic losses. The gun's impact on morale among German crews was profound. Memoirs and private letters describe the sensation of flying through a sky dense with AA fire as disorienting and surreal. The shrapnel bursts created a constant threat, each detonation unpredictable, forcing evasive maneuvers that disrupted formation integrity. Bombers that maintained their intended course often did so at the cost of structural damage or crew fatigue, while those that attempted erratic maneuvers frequently lost cohesion, making them vulnerable not only to AA fire, but also to RAF fighters vectored in by radar. One Luftwaffe pilot recounted a mission over Liverpool. "It felt as though we were swimming through a storm of needles. Each one could kill. Every moment the sky was alive, waiting to punish a mistake." The British also began experimenting with innovations to extend the reach and lethality of their high-speed AA guns. New shell designs, incorporating delayed fuses and variable explosive charges, allowed gunners to adjust for altitude and velocity of incoming aircraft. The predictor's calculations could now incorporate evasive tendencies observed in previous raids, giving a predictive edge that was almost uncanny. In practice, this meant that even when bombers altered speed or altitude mid-flight, the AA barrages adapted in near real time, sustaining the illusion of inevitability for attacking crews. Integration with searchlights and radar became even more sophisticated. Searchlight operators began coordinating with radar stations to illuminate targets in synchrony with gunfire, creating zones of concentrated visibility where predictors could lock on with unprecedented accuracy. In some cases, night raids were met with such precision that observers on the ground later noted entire bomber streams appearing illuminated for brief windows only to vanish behind flak bursts moments later. These tactics maximized the psychological pressure, as pilots could see threats but could not escape them. Training and discipline were equally critical to the success. Anti-aircraft crews worked in shifts, often enduring 12 to 14-hour watches during periods of sustained raids. Rotations were designed to maintain alertness, and teams rehearsed rapid loading procedures to maintain the incredible firing rates of the 2,400 rounds per minute system. Coordination exercises were conducted under blackout conditions, simulating raids with mock aircraft and signal flares. Crews learned to anticipate one another's movements instinctively, reducing human error to a minimum even during the most chaotic engagements. By early 1941, Luftwaffe losses over Britain were climbing steadily. Pilots increasingly reported that heavily defended areas were effectively no-go zones, forcing the German command to concentrate attacks on less critical targets or to fly at altitudes that decreased bombing accuracy. The effect on operational planning was substantial. Missions became longer, riskier, and less effective, with both mechanical attrition and psychological strain impacting the Luftwaffe's capacity to project sustained power. The interplay of prediction, speed, and firepower transformed the very nature of air defense. The high-speed AA guns were no longer static weapons, they were dynamic systems, capable of adjusting to enemy behavior in ways that prefigured modern automated defense systems. Every aspect, the gun's mechanical precision, the predictor's calculations, the radar's early warning, the coordination with searchlights, worked together to form an integrated network. The result was a defensive envelope that continuously pressured the Luftwaffe, forcing adaptations that played directly into Britain's strengths. By mid-1941, even as the Blitz's intensity began to wane, the reputation of Britain's high-speed AA guns had been firmly established. German airmen spoke of them in hushed tones, acknowledging that any approach over defended cities carried an almost certain threat of severe damage. The guns had demonstrated that numerical superiority in aircraft could be countered by ingenuity, integration, and relentless training. British AA fire, once considered secondary to fighter defense, had become an equal and in some ways superior deterrent, a force that could dictate the tempo, altitude, and formation integrity of the enemy before a single Spitfire took to the sky. The legacy of these weapons extended beyond the immediate tactical victories. The combination of high rate of fire, precise calculation, and real-time adaptation foreshadowed the principles of modern air defense. In the minds of the Luftwaffe pilots who survived, Britain's high-speed AA anti-aircraft guns were more than artillery. They were a manifestation of strategic intelligence, mechanical innovation, and human discipline operating at a scale that fundamentally altered the dynamics of air warfare. By the summer of 1941, the British high-speed anti-aircraft network had reached a level of integration and lethality that even the Luftwaffe command could no longer dismiss. The lessons learned from months of Blitz engagements had led to a continuous cycle of refinement in every element of the system. Predictors were upgraded with more precise mechanical computation, incorporating finer adjustments for wind shear, air density, and aircraft speed. Radar operators, initially relying on simple echo detection, had developed the ability to track multiple formations simultaneously, distinguishing between bombers and fighters with remarkable accuracy. Even ammunition handling had been optimized. High-capacity magazines, preloaded belts, and automated feeding mechanisms allowed each gun to sustain near maximum firing rates for longer periods without jamming or overheating. By late 1941, the cumulative effect of Britain's high-speed anti-aircraft guns had reached a decisive point. Across the southern and Midlands regions, a network of batteries, predictors, radar, and spotters had matured into a system that operated with the efficiency and lethality of a single organism. Each component reinforced the others, from the mechanical precision of the guns themselves to the human calculation in the predictor huts, all coordinated by radar stations that provided continuous, real-time surveillance of incoming Luftwaffe formations. For German air crews, the experience had become consistently nightmarish. Raids no longer relied on stealth or timing alone, because British defenses anticipated almost every conceivable maneuver. The engineering achievements behind these guns had reached near perfection. Breach mechanisms were fine-tuned to allow continuous operation under extreme stress. Tolerances tightened so that shells could be loaded and fired at rates approaching 2,400 per minute without catastrophic failure. Recoil systems absorbed the massive forces involved, preventing misalignment that could compromise accuracy. Guns were mounted on reinforced platforms with adjustable elevation and traverse, capable of following high-speed bombers as they maneuvered. Even environmental factors like temperature changes, rain, and wind gusts were accounted for, with crews adjusting firing solutions in real time based on observation and radar feedback. Perhaps most critical was the integration of multiple data sources. Predictors received inputs not only from visual spotters and telescopic observations, but also from chain-linked radar stations, plotting rooms, and even intelligence gathered from previous raids. Every approach vector could be analyzed for likely flight paths, potential evasive maneuvers, and bomber formation densities. Operators refined their calculations constantly, adjusting for altitude variations and airspeed fluctuations, effectively creating an automated response system long before electronic computers became standard. The result was a network in which every battery could engage with maximum efficiency, turning any portion of the sky into a coordinated kill zone. The human toll on Luftwaffe crews reflected this integration. Pilots described feeling constantly pinned by invisible pressure, as if the very airspace had been weaponized. Each shell burst represented a moment of lethal uncertainty, forcing continuous adjustments to altitude, heading, and speed. Bomber formations became fragmented, cohesion impossible, as the AA fire forced individual crews to prioritize survival over bombing accuracy. Instances of aircraft colliding mid-air, engines struck by shrapnel, or crews bailing over the channel became increasingly common. Operational fatigue mounted quickly. Long flights under the constant threat of flak were exhausting, and damaged aircraft required emergency landings, often on unfamiliar terrain, adding further pressure to the Luftwaffe's operational capabilities. In the UK, the anti-aircraft crews became experts in sustaining relentless operations. Extended rotations were carefully planned to maintain alertness. Teams rehearsed emergency reload procedures and blackout operations. Gunners and predictors refined communication protocols to ensure that any deviation in enemy flight paths could be addressed instantaneously. This level of discipline meant that even prolonged raids with hundreds of incoming aircraft over multiple hours could be met without a significant drop in firing efficiency. Shells continued to burst at staggering rates, the cumulative effect creating a nearly impenetrable barrier against enemy attack. The strategic consequences for the Luftwaffe were significant. No longer could German command plan missions solely on the basis of bomb load or fighter escort. Every operation had to consider the probability of losses from AA fire alone. Approaches had to be staggered, formations split, altitudes varied, all in attempts to minimize exposure. But the predictive and adaptive nature of British high-speed AA systems countered these adaptations with precision. Even when bombers altered speed, climbed or dived unexpectedly, or attempted to skirt the main flak belts, the overlapping coverage and coordinated fire patterns maintained a deadly consistency. For the first time in the air campaign over Britain, technological and operational synergy had effectively imposed conditions on the enemy rather than reacting to them. By the end of 1941, British anti-aircraft defenses had become a defining feature of the air war. Cities, ports, and industrial centers could be defended without complete reliance on fighter coverage, and even the most experienced Luftwaffe pilots approached missions with caution. The high-speed AA guns had proven that mechanical ingenuity, human discipline, and the integration of emerging technologies could produce a force multiplier capable of dictating terms of engagement. Each shell fired at 2,400 rounds per minute carried not just explosive potential, but a psychological weight, disrupting formations, damaging aircraft, and eroding morale. The lessons of this period were clear. Air superiority could not be achieved by numbers alone. Precision, prediction, and the intelligent application of technology could counter even numerically superior forces. The British high-speed anti-aircraft guns had transformed air defense from reactive measures into proactive, dominating control of the battlefield. They had redefined what it meant to defend a nation from the air, demonstrating that human ingenuity combined with mechanical innovation could create a weapon system feared not merely for its firepower, but for the inevitability it imposed on any adversary daring to enter Britain's skies. By the time the Luftwaffe began scaling back raids over heavily defended urban centers, the reputation of Britain's anti-aircraft system was firmly established. Pilots and planners alike recognized that the combination of relentless fire, predictive computation, and integrated observation was not just a temporary obstacle, but a permanent feature of the air war. The guns had proven their capacity to control airspace, influence enemy behavior, and protect critical infrastructure at a scale previously unimaginable. They were more than defensive artillery. They were instruments of strategic dominance, a warning to any adversary that the skies over Britain were no longer open. They were contested, monitored, and lethal. In the final analysis, the British high-speed anti-aircraft guns of World War II represented a triumph of engineering, coordination, and tactical foresight. The integration of rapid-fire capability, predictive targeting, radar guidance, and disciplined human operation created a system that not only defended cities, but shaped the very behavior of enemy air crews. Flying through a sky saturated with flak became a perilous ordeal, where every choice carried risk, and every maneuver could be anticipated. In this crucible, the Luftwaffe learned the limits of technological superiority when confronted by ingenuity and preparation. The guns, firing thousands of rounds per minute with relentless accuracy, ensured that Britain could endure, resist, and ultimately prevail in the air, turning the threat of bombardment into an arena where the defenders dictated the terms and the attackers learned to fear every inch of the sky.